The knife was already at her throat when Lena Hart saw the pup. She did not scream. Screaming in the lower market only brought more trouble, not less. The man behind her smelled of stale ale and old anger, and his arm was locked across her collarbone so tight she could feel her own pulse knocking against his wrist. "Give me the coins," he said. "All of them." Lena's fingers were still curled around the small cloth pouch she had spent 4 days earning. 5 coins. 5 copper coins that were supposed to buy flour and oil, maybe a candle if the flour was cheap enough. Her whole week folded into one fist. She did not let go. That was the wrong choice, and she knew it the moment the blade pressed harder against her skin. But something in her had gone stubborn, the way it always did when she was cornered. Some old stupid pride that refused to bend, even when bending was the smart thing to do. Then the cage at the corner of the market stall rattled. A pup threw itself against the bars, snarling, and the sound it made was not the sound a pup should make. It was low and old, older than an animal that size had any right to sound. The trader who owned the stall cursed and kicked the cage to quiet it, but it did not quiet. It kept slamming its body into the iron, over and over, eyes locked not on the trader, not on the crowd, but on Lena. The man holding the knife flinched, just slightly, just enough. Lena drove her elbow back into his stomach with everything she had, twisted free, and ran 3 steps before her legs remembered they belonged to someone who had not eaten a full meal in 2 days. She stumbled. He caught her sleeve. The cage rattled again, harder, and this time the latch gave. The pup did not attack the man. It simply stood between them, head low, a sound coming out of its chest that was not quite a growl and not quite anything Lena had heard from a living animal before. The man looked at it, looked at Lena, and decided that 5 copper coins were not worth whatever was about to happen next. He let go of her sleeve and disappeared into the crowd the way trouble always disappeared once it had already done its damage. Lena stood there shaking, her palm bleeding where the knife had nicked it during the struggle, her coin pouch somehow still clutched in her other fist. The trader grabbed the pup by the scruff and shoved it back toward the cage, muttering about a beast that bit 2 handlers and would bite a third if someone did not put it down soon. The pup did not fight him. It simply turned its head and looked at Lena again, and there was something in that look that did not belong on an animal being sold for meat or labor. It looked like it was waiting for her to decide something. "How much?" Lena heard herself say. The trader blinked at her. "For that? 10 coins and you'd be a fool. Bites. Won't eat what it's given. Wears that muzzle for a reason." She looked at the muzzle properly for the first time. It was not the leather strap most stray handlers used. It was forged metal, dark and heavy, fitted with a small mark stamped into the side that she did not recognize, but that made her skin prickle anyway, the way a word in a foreign language can still sound like a warning. "5, she said. "That's all I have." "Then you don't have enough." "You just watched it save me from a man with a knife," Lena said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You want to keep something that fights back that hard for whoever hasn't fed it in a week, or you want 5 coins and 1 less problem on your stall today." The trader looked at the pup. The pup looked at nothing, patient, still bleeding a little at the mouth from where the muzzle had cut into it during the struggle. 5, the trader said, spitting to the side like the number tasted bad. "And you never bought it from me if anyone official comes asking." Lena did not understand that last part. She would understand it, later, far too late to change anything, for now she only heard the sound of coins passing from her palm into his, and the sound of a rope being tied loosely around a pup's neck, and the sound of her own heartbeat finally slowing enough to hear anything at all. She led the pup home through streets that smelled like rain that had not fallen yet. It did not pull on the rope. It walked exactly where she walked, half a step behind her right shoulder, the same place a shadow would walk if a shadow had learned how to guard someone. Her flat was 1 room above a shuttered bakery, with a window that did not close all the way, and a floor that creaked in the same 3 places no matter how carefully she stepped. She had lived there since her mother died, paying rent with sewing work that ruined her eyes a little more every month. It was not much. It was hers, and there was a strange comfort in bringing something else that was hers into it, even something with teeth and a muzzle and a look in its eyes that did not belong to anything simple. She knelt down in front of it once the door was shut. "I'm going to take that off you," she said, as if it could understand her, as if talking to a stray in an empty room was not, in fact, the loneliest thing a person could do. "Don't bite me. I only have the one good hand." It did not bite her. The muzzle came away with more effort than she expected. Buckles rusted stiff, and underneath it the pup's jaw was raw in places where the metal had worn the fur away entirely. She winced at the sight of it. Whoever had put that muzzle on had not cared whether the wearer was comfortable. They had cared only that it stayed silent. The pup did not eat the bread she offered. It did not eat the second night either, or the third. It drank water when she was not looking and refused it when she was, like it did not want her to see it needing anything from her at all. It paced the length of the room after dark, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, the way a person paces when they are trying to think their way out of something instead of walk their way out of it. Lena watched it from her bed some nights, unable to sleep, and thought that she had bought herself a very strange kind of company. Not comfort, exactly. Comfort was warm and soft, and asked nothing of you. This was something else. This was like sharing a room with a held breath. On the 4th night, she woke to the sound of the pup standing at the door, low and still, ears forward, and she sat up fast enough to feel her heart slam once against her ribs. "What is it?" she whispered. There was no answer, because there could not be an answer, because it was an animal, and animals did not answer. But a moment later she heard footsteps outside on the landing, uneven, the kind that belonged to someone who had had too much to drink and had lost track of which door was theirs. The footsteps stopped directly outside her own door. A hand tried the latch. The pup's growl was so low Lena felt it more than heard it, a vibration through the floorboards under her bare feet. The latch held. The footsteps, after a long, ugly pause, moved on, muttering something about the wrong floor. Lena did not sleep again that night. She sat with her back against the wall and her knees pulled to her chest and watched the pup stand guard at a door that had never needed guarding before, and she thought, for the first time since she had spent her last 5 coins on a wounded animal with a stranger's mark stamped into its muzzle, that she might have gotten the better end of that trade after all. She did not know yet what that mark meant. She did not know that somewhere across the city, in rooms with far higher ceilings than hers, people were already searching for something they had lost 3 days ago, something that had slipped a collar meant to hold far more than an ordinary animal, something that had vanished into the lower market the same afternoon a poor seamstress had walked home with a rope in her hand and a muzzle in her pocket. For now she only knew that the room felt less empty than it had in a very long time, and that the pup, when it finally lay down near dawn, chose the spot closest to her bed and not the spot closest to the door. That was the first night. There would be many more before anyone came looking. By the 2nd week, Lena had started calling him Ash, though she never said the name out loud when anyone else could hear. It felt private, the way a secret feels private, even though it was only a name for a stray dog she had bought for 5 coins. Ash grew fast, too fast, if she let herself think about it clearly, which she mostly avoided doing because clear thinking led to questions she did not have answers for. Within 2 weeks his shoulders had broadened enough that her landlord, a narrow man named Corwin, who collected rent with the enthusiasm of someone collecting a debt from an enemy, stopped at her door specifically to comment on it. "That's no pup," Corwin said, looking at Ash the way a man looks at a bill he did not expect. "That's near a full-grown hound already, and it's been what, 2 weeks? He eats a lot," Lena said, which was not even true, because Ash still barely touched what she gave him. Corwin did not look convinced, but he also did not want to get closer to the animal to argue the point, so he took his rent and left. Ash watched him go from just inside the doorway, utterly silent, and Lena noticed that his silence had a shape to it, the shape of someone deciding whether a person deserved to be trusted. She noticed a lot of things about Ash that she did not have words for. He understood her in ways that unsettled her before they ever comforted her. The first time it happened, she had reached for her shawl on a cold morning and found it already resting across the back of her chair, though she was certain she had left it folded in the trunk the night before. She stared at Ash. Ash looked back at her with the particular blankness of an animal that has done nothing at all. The second time, she had been halfway through a sentence about needing more thread for the dress she was mending, thinking only to herself, not speaking aloud, and Ash had risen and walked to the small basket by the window where she kept her sewing supplies and nosed it toward her feet. "That's not normal," she told him, out loud, in the empty room. "You know that's not normal." Ash lay down and put his head on his paws, which was the closest thing to an apology an animal could offer, and Lena decided, the way people decide things they cannot afford to examine too closely, that she would not think about it any further. What she could not decide not to think about was the way he stood between her and the door every single night, not resting near it, standing at it, facing outward, as if the door itself were the thing that needed watching, rather than anything that might come through it. One evening, coming home late from a delivery of finished mending, she was 3 streets from her building when a group of men spilled out of a tavern ahead of her, loud and unsteady, blocking the narrow lane in the particular way that groups of drunk men block lanes without ever quite meaning to. She turned to take the longer route around, the one that added 20 minutes to her walk but kept her off that stretch of road after dark. Halfway down the alternate lane, she heard something behind her keeping pace. She spun, heart already climbing into her throat, and found Ash trotting a few paces back, having followed her the entire way from home without her ever noticing him leave the flat. "How did you get out?" she said. And then, because there was no good answer to that either, she simply let him walk beside her the rest of the way, grateful for company she had not asked for and could not explain. It was around the start of the 3rd week that the foreman began to notice her. Dorian Crane ran the floor at the textile house, where Lena brought her finished piecework twice a week, a tall alpha with a laugh that came too easily and eyes that lingered a beat too long on every omega who walked through his door. Lena had learned, the way most poor omegas in the lower district learned, exactly how much of that lingering to ignore and exactly how much distance to keep between herself and men whose good moods could turn without warning. Crane had always been polite to her before, in the careful, transactional way that men are polite when they want something they have not yet decided how to ask for. That week the politeness changed shape. He complimented her stitching in a tone that had nothing to do with stitching. He found reasons to stand closer than the counter required. He asked, twice, whether a woman living alone ever got lonely in a flat above an empty bakery. Lena kept her answers short and her eyes on her work and told herself it would pass, because that was what she had always told herself, and it had always, eventually, been true. At home, she found herself talking to Ash more than she talked to any person in her life, which said more about her life than she liked to admit. She told him about the debt she still owed on her mother's burial, a debt that grew a little heavier every month, no matter how many extra pieces she sewed. She told him about Crane's lingering eyes, half joking, half not, testing the shape of her own fear by saying it out loud to something that could not judge her for having it. Ash listened the way he always listened, utterly still, utterly attentive, and there were moments Lena could have sworn the stillness sharpened whenever she mentioned Crane's name, though she told herself that was only her imagination working overtime on an animal that could not possibly understand the difference between one man's name and another's. One night, reaching to scratch behind his ear the way she had a dozen times before, she felt him go rigid under her hand, a full flinch that ran the length of his body and was gone again before she could be certain she had seen it at all. She pulled her hand back. "Sorry," she said, though she did not know what she was apologizing for, only that something in the room had gone tight and wrong for a moment, and her instinct was to smooth it over the way she smoothed over every small hurt in her life, quickly, quietly, without asking questions that might not have comfortable answers. Ash did not look at her for the rest of that evening. He lay near the door as always, but his eyes stayed open long after she had gone to sleep, fixed on nothing, the way eyes fix on nothing when the mind behind them is somewhere else entirely, somewhere Lena could not follow and was not sure she was meant to. She did not reach for him again that week, and something in the room, she noticed, loosened when she stopped trying. By the start of the 4th week, the two of them had settled into a rhythm that was almost peaceful. She sewed. He watched the door. She talked, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about everything, and he listened without ever once demanding that she stop. In the evenings, when the ache in her hands from the needlework grew too sharp to keep going, she would sit on the floor beside him instead of in her chair, not touching him, just close enough to feel the warmth coming off his side, and something about that closeness felt less lonely than anything had felt since her mother died. It was on one of those quiet evenings that the trouble finally caught up to her. A knock came at the door. 3 short raps, 2 polished to belong to Corwin collecting rent, and 2 controlled to belong to a drunk who had lost his floor. Lena opened it to find Dorian Crane standing on her landing, out of his work clothes, smiling the smile of a man who believed he had already been granted something he had not, in fact, been offered. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, which was a lie, because nobody who worked at the textile house had any reason to be in this neighborhood after dark. Behind her, low and constant, she heard Ash rise to his feet. Crane's eyes moved past her shoulder and found the animal standing there, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face, something that was not quite fear, but was closer to fear than Lena had ever seen on him before. Then he covered it with another smile, wider this time, and said that a woman alone should not keep a beast that size in a one-room flat, that it was not safe, that perhaps he could help her find somewhere better suited. "I'm not alone," Lena said, and found that she believed it in a way she had not believed anything in a long time. Crane's smile thinned at the edges. He said he would come by another time, when she was in a better mood to receive visitors, and left with the unhurried stride of a man who considers a closed door only a delay and not a refusal. Lena shut the door and leaned against it, breathing harder than the conversation should have warranted, and Ash pressed his shoulder against her leg in the closest thing to comfort an animal his size could offer without knocking her over. "He's going to come back," she said quietly. "Men like that always come back." Ash made a low sound in his chest, not quite a growl, something closer to a promise, and though Lena told herself again that she was reading far too much meaning into an animal's noises, she slept easier that night than she had any night since Crane's eyes had first started lingering too long. She did not know that 3 streets away, in a room above a shuttered shop, men in city colors were quietly comparing notes about a missing hound last seen near the lower market 3.5 weeks ago, and that the trail, thin as it was, had begun, very slowly, to point in her direction. The storeroom at the textile house smelled of raw wool and dust, and it was the last place Lena wanted to be alone with Dorian Crane, which was, of course, exactly where he arranged for her to be. It happened on a delivery day, the kind of ordinary afternoon that gives no warning of what it is about to become. Lena had brought in 6 finished pieces, more than her usual load, hoping the extra coin would finally chip away at the debt that never seemed to shrink, no matter how many nights she stayed up past exhaustion with a needle in her hand. The front counter was empty when she arrived. A younger girl, one of the counting clerks, told her Crane wanted the pieces inspected in the back before payment, which was not how it usually worked, but Lena had learned not to argue with the man who decided whether she got paid at all. The storeroom door closed behind her before she registered that Crane had followed her in rather than waited at the counter. "You've been avoiding me," he said, and his voice had lost the practiced warmth it wore in front of other people. What was left underneath it was flatter, colder, the voice of a man who believed patience was a debt owed to him and felt he had paid it in full. "I've been working," Lena said, keeping the counter of shelves between them, though the storeroom was narrow enough that the counter offered less protection than she wanted it to. "You've been working," Crane repeated, and laughed, low, without any humor in it at all. You sew for coppers in a room that isn't even yours, and you call that living. I could change that. I've been trying to tell you that for weeks. I have somewhere to be, Lena said, and took a step toward the door. His hand closed around her wrist before she reached it. It was not gentle. It was the grip of a man who has decided, somewhere in the space of a single breath, that a woman's discomfort is a smaller problem than his own wanting, and Lena felt the old cold drop in her stomach that every Omega learns to recognize long before she has words for what it means. She pulled against his grip. He tightened it. Her shoulder wrenched at an angle that made her gasp, and for one long, terrible second, the storeroom narrowed down to nothing but the sound of her own pulse and the certainty that no one at the front counter could hear her over the noise of the looms. Then the wall beside them exploded inward. That was the only way Lena's mind could make sense of it afterward, though she knew, even in the moment, that walls did not explode and that what had actually happened was a great deal simpler and a great deal worse. A window shutter, old and poorly latched, had been forced from the outside with enough force to splinter its frame, and through the gap came something too fast and too large to be entirely animal, a shape all teeth and fury that did not growl so much as it announced a verdict already reached. Crane's grip on her wrist vanished. Lena stumbled back against the shelves, gasping, and did not see everything that happened next, because some part of her had gone very still and very far away, the way a mind protects itself when it cannot bear to witness its own rescue in full detail. She heard Crane's voice break into something high and human and afraid, heard fabric tearing, heard a crash of shelves going over, heard, underneath all of it, a low, continuous sound that she would later understand had been a growl held at the exact edge of restraint, a warning given, and given again, to a man too frightened to heed it. By the time her vision cleared, Crane was on the floor against the far wall, his sleeve torn through, and a shallow line of blood welling along his forearm where teeth had caught him once, a warning bite, and not a killing one, though Lena did not know yet that the distinction had been chosen deliberately. Ash stood over him, every muscle coiled, and for one suspended moment, Lena believed she was looking at something that would finish what it had started. "Ash," she said. Just his name. Not a command, because she had no right to command an animal this size to do anything. Only his name, spoken the way you speak to someone you are afraid of losing to their own anger. He stopped. He did not relax, not entirely, but the growl folded back into his chest, and he backed away from Crane, one slow step at a time, until he stood beside Lena instead, pressing against her leg hard enough that she had to brace herself against the shelf to keep from stumbling. Crane did not come back to work the next day. Word moved through the textile house the way word always moves through places where everyone depends on everyone else for their wages, and by the end of the week, the story had been reshaped a dozen times over, most versions involving a stray dog gone mad, rather than a foreman who had cornered a woman half his size in a room with no windows worth the name. Lena said nothing to correct or confirm any of it. She collected her payment from the counting clerk, who would not meet her eyes, and walked home with Ash beside her and did not speak the entire way. That night, she filled a basin with warm water and knelt in front of him to clean the blood from around his mouth, though most of it, she realized with a strange, twisting relief, had not been his own. Ash sat still and let her work, flinching only once, when the cloth passed too near his jaw where the old muzzle scars had never fully faded. "You could have killed him," she said quietly, not accusing, just saying the fact out loud the way she said most things she needed to hear spoken. Ash made no sound. "You didn't," she said. "I think you could have, and you didn't." She did not know why that mattered so much to her, only that it did, that somewhere in the last month she had stopped thinking of him as a stray she had rescued, and started thinking of him as something closer to a person who had chosen, again and again, to be gentle with her specifically, and dangerous only for her sake. She finished cleaning the cut along his jaw and sat back on her heels, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then, for the first time since she had brought him home, Ash lay down not at the door, but beside her, his shoulder against her knee, his head resting near enough to her lap that she could feel his breath slow into something even and deep. Lena sat with her back against the wall and her hand resting lightly on his fur and did not try to move him, and did not try to name what she was feeling, because she suspected that naming it would only make it harder to carry. She should have known that quiet did not last long in her life. It never had. 3 days later, the trouble that had been circling the lower district for weeks finally found its way to her door, in a form she could not simply close a latch against. It began with soldiers, not many, 4 of them, in city colors she recognized from notices posted near the market square, moving door to door along her street with the unhurried thoroughness of men who were paid by the hour rather than by the result. She watched from her window as they stopped at the bakery below, then the tailor 2 doors down, asking questions she could not hear the answers to, showing something to each shopkeeper that made most of them shake their heads and a few of them pause a beat too long before shaking their heads as well. Ash went still the moment the soldiers appeared. Not alert, the way he went still at footsteps on the landing, or fists on her door. This was a different stillness, the stillness of something recognizing a danger it had hoped never to see again, and Lena felt her stomach drop as she watched him retreat from the window into the shadow furthest from it, lower to the ground than she had ever seen him hold himself before. "What is it?" she whispered, though she already suspected, somewhere beneath the part of her mind still clinging to easier explanations, that this had something to do with the muzzle she had taken off him the very first night, the one she had never thrown away, the one that still sat wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her trunk because some instinct had told her not to discard proof of where he had come from. The soldiers did not reach her building that day. They turned down a side street 2 doors before hers and did not come back before dark, and Lena told herself, the way she had told herself so many things over the past month, that it had been nothing, a routine sweep, unrelated to her at all. She did not sleep well that night. Ash did not sleep at all. He kept his post at the door until dawn, and when she woke, bleary and unrested, she found him sitting exactly where she had last seen him, eyes open, watching a door that had not moved an inch all night. "You're scaring me," she told him honestly, because there was no one else in the room to hear the confession, and she badly needed to say it out loud to something. Ash crossed the room to her, slow, deliberate, and pressed his head against her hand where it hung at her side, the closest thing to an apology or a reassurance an animal that size could offer, though Lena was no longer entirely certain, in the growing light of that morning, that she was dealing only with an animal at all. Later that week, mending work brought her past the market square again, the same square where she had bought him for 5 coins a month before, and she saw, nailed fresh to the notice post beside the fountain, a new bulletin that had not been there the week prior. She did not need to read all of it to feel the ground tilt slightly beneath her feet. She read enough. A missing hound, a rival house, a curse cast mid-change. Last seen near the Eastern Market District, roughly 1 month past. Reward offered for information. No question asked of anyone who had, in ignorance, taken the animal in. Lena stood in front of that notice for a long time, the noise of the square fading into something distant and unimportant, and felt the shape of the last month rearrange itself in her mind, piece by piece. The too fast growth, the impossible understanding, the muzzle stamped with a mark she had never recognized, the restraint in a storeroom that could easily have ended in death, and had not, and the stillness at her door, the moment soldiers in city colors had come asking questions 2 streets away. She walked home slower than usual that day, her mind turning over questions she was not sure she wanted answered, and when she opened her own door, Ash was waiting exactly where he always waited, watching her the way he had watched her from the very first cage, patient, quiet, and entirely aware, she now understood, of exactly how much time they had left before the world outside her one small room finally caught up to both of them. Lena did not sleep the night after she read the notice. She sat at her small table with a single candle burning low, the cloth bundle from the bottom of her trunk unwrapped in front of her, the muzzle resting on the wood between her hands like something that might still bite if she looked away from it too long. The stamped mark on its side caught the candlelight at an angle she had never studied before, and now that she knew to look for it, she could see it clearly for what it was. Not a maker's stamp, not a trader's brand, but a crest, sharp-lined and deliberate, the kind of mark that belonged to people who did not sell things at market stalls for 5 coins. Ash sat across the room, watching her study it, and did not come closer the way he usually did when she was upset. He seemed, if anything, to be giving her the space to decide something on her own, the way a person waits outside a door, rather than pushing through it uninvited. "You're not just a stray," Lena said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, given how unsteady she felt. "You never were." Ash's ears lowered slightly, not in threat, but in something that looked almost like shame, and Lena felt an unexpected pull of sympathy cut through her fear, because whatever he was, whoever he had been before a rival house, had done something to him that left him muzzled and sold on a lower market stall. He had spent the past month protecting her without once asking for anything in return. "I bought you," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "because you looked like you needed someone to buy you before something worse happened. I've learned to be careful with that word, ended, because the thing I'm describing didn't end so much as exhaust itself." The name from the notice hung in the room between them, unspoken until she said it herself. The Eastern House's lost hunting hound, cursed mid-change by a rival family looking to weaken a throne they could not challenge outright, vanished into the lower market the very week Lena had walked home with a rope and a muzzle she did not understand. Ash did not deny it, because he could not, and something about the honesty of his silence told her more than words would have. "They're going to come looking properly," she said, "not just soldiers walking door to door, someone who knows exactly what they lost." She expected fear to be the only thing she felt at that thought, and was surprised, sitting there in the candlelight with a stranger's crest pressed into the muzzle in her hands, to find that fear was tangled up with something else entirely, something that felt uncomfortably close to grief, for a thing she had not yet lost. Over the following days, the search tightened around the lower district the way a net tightens when the fish inside it has already been spotted. Soldiers returned to her street twice more, each time a little more thorough, each time lingering a beat longer at buildings that had been searched only briefly before. Corwin, her landlord, mentioned to her in passing that a well-dressed man had asked him, very politely, whether any of his tenants had recently taken in an unusually large dog, and Lena had smiled and said she hadn't heard of any such thing, and felt the lie sit heavy and strange in her chest the entire rest of that day. Ash grew quieter as the days passed. Not withdrawn exactly, but focused in a way that made Lena feel like she was watching someone brace for a conversation they had been dreading for a very long time. He stopped following her all the way to the textile house, choosing instead to wait at the edge of the lower district where the crowds thinned, as if he understood that being seen too openly beside her now carried a risk neither of them could afford. It was on one of those solitary walks home, without him beside her for the first time in weeks, that Lena finally let herself cry, quick and furious and confused, over the fact that she did not know whether she was more afraid of losing him to whoever came looking, or of learning exactly who he had been before she ever placed 5 coins into a trader's palm. She composed the question she had been avoiding on the 6th night after the notice, sitting across from him with the candle burned down to its last inch. "If they find you," she said, "will you want to go back?" Ash lifted his head and looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there in the early weeks, something that had grown alongside his body and his strength and his strange, careful gentleness, something that looked, Lena thought, uncomfortably close to a decision already made and simply not yet spoken. He did not answer, because he could not in the shape he currently wore, and Lena did not push for an answer she knew he had no way to give her. She only reached out, slower than she once would have, and rested her hand against the side of his face where the old muzzle scars had finally, mostly, faded, and felt him lean into the touch instead of flinching from it, the way he had flinched the very first time she had reached for him weeks before. "Whatever you decide," she said. "I bought you for 5 coins because you looked like you needed someone. I never expected to need you back." She did not know, saying it, how true those words would prove to be within the week. The soldiers found the thread they had been following on a gray morning near the end of the 3rd month, not through any clever detective work, but through the plain, ordinary betrayal of a trader who remembered exactly which seamstress had walked away from his stall with a muzzled animal roughly 12 weeks before, once the reward for information grew large enough to loosen his memory considerably. Lena was at the market when she heard it, a ripple of talk moving through the stalls faster than she could outpace it. Something about a location finally confirmed, a house identified, riders sent ahead to secure the district before anyone official arrived in person. She abandoned her errand and ran the entire way home, her chest burning, her mind racing through every version of what might be waiting for her when she reached her own door, none of them comforting. Ash was waiting inside when she burst in, breathless, and he read the fear on her face before she managed a single word. "They know," she gasped. "They know where you are. Someone talked. They're coming." For the first time since she had brought him home, Ash did not retreat toward the shadows or lower himself out of sight. He rose to his full height instead, squared and steady, and looked at her with an expression that no longer belonged entirely to an animal, an expression that carried in it something like resolve, something like relief, something like the particular calm of a person who has spent 3 months dreading a moment that has finally, at last, arrived, and finds that the dread was worse than the moment itself is likely to be. Lena's hands were shaking as she reached again for the muzzle still sitting wrapped on the shelf, some instinct telling her that whatever happened next, she did not want to be caught having hidden the one piece of proof that might matter most. Outside, faint at first and then unmistakable, came the sound of horses on cobblestone, more of them than any ordinary patrol would need, moving with the particular discipline of soldiers who had been given a location and told not to lose it a second time. Lena's heart climbed into her throat as the sound grew closer, and she looked once more at Ash, standing tall and still and finally, entirely unafraid, and understood, in the space of a single held breath, that whatever walked through her door within the hour was going to change everything about the small, careful life she had built above a shuttered bakery, and that there was no longer any version of tonight in which that change did not come. The horses stopped outside her building with a precision that told Lena more than any rumor had, riders dismounting in a single motion, boots striking cobblestone in a rhythm too even to belong to ordinary soldiers going through the motions of a routine search. She stood in the middle of her one-room flat, with her back straight and her hands folded tightly in front of her, the muzzle still resting on the shelf where she had placed it hours ago, and waited for the knock she knew was coming. It came, 3 measured strikes, and then a voice, low and controlled, asking permission to enter, rather than demanding it, which surprised her more than almost anything else that had happened over the past 3 months. She opened the door. The man standing on her landing filled the narrow space in a way that had nothing to do with his height, though he was tall, and everything to do with the sheer weight of presence that came off him like heat off a summer road. He wore no crown, no ceremonial mark of office, only a plain dark coat that had clearly been chosen for moving quickly through a crowded district rather than for making an impression, and yet Lena understood within a single breath, without needing anyone to confirm it, that this was the man from the notices, restored to a shape he had been forced out of for 3 long months, standing on her landing because something that belonged to him had, at last, been found. Behind him stood a small formation of guards, tense and alert, and behind them a wider ring of soldiers keeping the street itself clear, as if the entire lower district had been quietly emptied of witnesses before this particular door was ever approached. "You're the woman who bought a hound at the lower market 3 months ago," he said. It was not a question. "I bought an animal that needed buying," Lena said, and was proud, distantly, of how steady her own voice sounded. "I didn't know what he was." The man's gaze moved past her shoulder into the room, and Lena watched something shift across his face the moment it landed on the shape standing there. something that cracked through the controlled composure he had worn on the landing, like a mask worn slightly too long. He did not rush past her. He waited, visibly restraining himself, until Lena stepped aside to let him through, and only then did he cross the small room in 3 long strides and drop to one knee in front of the animal who had guarded her door for 3 months, without once explaining why. "Kael," he said, and the name landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water, spreading outward until it touched every corner of Lena's understanding at once. Not a stray, not simply a hound, a name, spoken with the particular ache of someone who has said it in his head every single night for 3 months without any certainty he would ever get to say it aloud again. The change, when it came, did not happen the way Lena had half imagined it might in her most frightened, most sleepless nights. There was no violence to it, no tearing, only a slow, exhausted unfolding, as if the shape Ash had worn for 3 months had simply been a held breath finally allowed to release. Where the animal had stood a moment before, a man now knelt on her floor, breathing hard, his bare shoulders shaking slightly with an effort Lena suspected had cost him more than she would ever fully understand. And when he lifted his head to look at the king kneeling in front of him, his eyes were the same eyes that had watched her from a market cage 3 months ago, patient and entirely aware. "Kael," the king said again, softer this time, gripping the other man's shoulder like he needed the contact to believe what he was seeing. 3 months. We thought the curse had you for good." "It nearly did," Kael said, and his voice, the first Lena had ever heard from him, was rough from disuse, low and careful, a voice that had clearly not been used in a very long time. His eyes moved from the king to Lena, standing frozen near the door, and something in his expression softened in a way she had only ever seen directed at her before now. "It would have, if she hadn't bought me before the traitor sold me on to someone who wouldn't have cared whether I lived past the week." The king rose slowly and turned to face Lena properly for the first time, and she felt the full weight of his attention land on her like a physical thing, assessing, measuring, and, to her quiet surprise, entirely without the arrogance she might have expected from a man of his station. "Do you understand what you did?" he asked her, "buying him the way you did?" "I understood I had 5 coins and an animal that was going to be beaten, or worse if someone didn't take him," Lena said. "I didn't understand anything else until much later." "He was cursed by a rival house mid-change," the king said. "Trapped in that shape, unable to speak, unable to explain himself to anyone who might have helped him, and sold within the same week to a market trader who very nearly handed him over to men who would have killed him rather than risk keeping a beast that bit. If you hadn't bought him when you did, at the price you paid, we would have found a body instead of a brother." The word landed heavier in the room than Lena expected. Brother, not subject, not soldier, not simply the king's missing hound. Family, lost and searched for across 3 months, with an intensity that only made sense once she understood exactly what had been at stake. Kael, still kneeling, still gathering the strength to stand fully upright after 3 months trapped in a shape not his own, reached out and took Lena's hand in his, the same gesture he had made 100 times over the past 3 months, with a muzzled jaw and no words to explain what he meant by it. "You never asked me for anything," he said. "Not once. In 3 months, you fed me even when I wouldn't eat. You cleaned my wounds, and never asked why they were there. You defended me to your landlord, and never asked what I was hiding from him." He paused, and something raw moved across his face. Something that had been building, Lena realized, for far longer than the 3 months she had known him. "I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. You wanted nothing at all. That is worth more than any crown I stand to lose or keep." The king watched this exchange with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last minute, from urgent relief into something quieter, more considering, and when he spoke again his voice carried the weight of a decision already forming. "The house that cursed him will answer for it," he said. "That is a matter for the court, and it does not concern you directly. But the woman who kept my brother alive when an entire kingdom's soldiers could not find him in 3 months of searching does concern me a great deal." He looked at Lena with the same measuring attention as before, though softer now, curious rather than merely assessing. What would you ask of the crown, if the crown were offering? Lena thought of the debt still hanging over her mother's burial, the rent that never got easier, the years of ruined eyesight from needlework that paid barely enough to survive on. She thought of all the practical, sensible things a poor Omega in her position should have asked for in that moment, and found, when she opened her mouth, that none of them were what came out. "I don't want anything from the crown," she said. "I bought a scared animal because he needed buying. I didn't do it to be repaid." The king studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested this was not the answer he was used to receiving from anyone who stood in front of him with a request half-formed on their tongue. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, glancing at Kael, whose hand had not once let go of Lena's during the entire exchange, "the repayment is not mine to decide." He inclined his head, the smallest fraction of a bow, more courtesy than protocol strictly required, and gathered his guards with a single gesture, leaving instructions that the house would be watched and word sent when the court was ready to receive his brother properly. Within minutes the horses outside had gone quiet again, the street emptying back into its ordinary lower district hush, as if a king had not in fact just knelt on the floor of a one-room flat above a shuttered bakery. Kael remained. He stood slowly, testing the unfamiliar weight of standing on two legs after 3 months of 4, and Lena found herself staring up at a man she had spent 3 months speaking to as though he could understand her, never once imagining that every word had landed exactly where she meant it to. "You're really going to have to leave," she said, because it seemed like the honest thing to say, even though her chest ached at the shape of the words. "Eventually," Kael said, "there is a court to face, a curse to answer for, a brother who has not stopped worrying since the day I disappeared. That will take time. And after." He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the very first cage, patient and entirely certain of something she had not yet let herself believe. "After," he said, "I intend to come back to this door. Not as a debt repaid, not as a king's brother offering charity to the woman who saved him, simply as someone who spent 3 months learning exactly who you are when you thought no one who mattered was watching, and who has no intention of losing that now that he finally has the words to say so." Lena did not have an answer ready for that, standing in the small room that had held nothing but the two of them for 3 quiet, careful months, and found that she did not need one yet. Some things, she was learning, did not require an immediate answer. Some things could simply be allowed to stand open, unresolved, full of everything that had not yet been said, while the two people who mattered most to that unfinished sentence decided, slowly and honestly, what they wanted to build in the space where it still hung. Outside, the lower district returned to its ordinary noise, market carts and tired voices, and the particular hush of an evening settling over a street that had, for one unlikely hour, held the full attention of a kingdom. Inside, Lena stood with her hand still held in Kael's, and thought that whatever came next, whatever court proceedings and titles and complications waited on the other side of that door, she would not trade the 5 coins she had spent 3 months ago for anything the crown could offer in their place. The door stood open behind them, morning light falling across the floor where a muzzled pup had once paced 3 steps and back, 3 steps and back, learning slowly that this small room was not a cage at all. Neither of them moved to close it, not yet. There was no need to decide, tonight, whether that door led back out into the world Kael had been born to, or forward into something neither of them had a name for. For now it was enough to stand together in the space between those two futures, unresolved, unafraid, and entirely unwilling to let go of the hand that had found its way home.